Today we're talking about buffs. But before we begin, a quick note on the health HUD I was talking about in my last video, which basically, if it gets enough attention, I will forward to Hyris Ajax and show him that people want this for next season. I have made the tweet now, I will link it down below in the comments in the description, so if you want to vote for that or show your appreciation for that, then you can do that through that link. With that out of the way, let's get into the topic. So this is something rather casual, but I kind of felt like touching upon this after a discussion on Twitter about which jungle buff is actually the strongest one or even the most broken one. This is specifically for the jungle buffs in Conquest, so there are some other buffs like the Apophis buffs that I will not factor in here. The one buff that we kind of will exclude as well is Fire Giant. Fire Giant buff is so good that it's just god tier, and if we have to talk about which buff is the best, Fire Giant will win against all the others. But I want to have a comparison between the buffs that are on the map that you can get at any point of the game and that really are somewhat held in equal value, and at least when it comes to the buff holding camps all having similar strength. Now all these buffs have very different values, so you can't just go about this completely mathematically and say these numbers are better than these, because they all fulfill completely different functions. But there are certain things that can be said about their functionality, which role they play in the game, and what makes them better or worse, to give them at least some level of comparability, but at the same time, it's always personal opinion. Maybe you're the biggest fan of the Void buff and you think it's better than every other buff and there's some secret strat in your build how you can make use of it. Maybe not, but you get the idea. It's something that you could personally feel like is better than I will value it here. So we'll give this a disclaimer of being an opinion piece, even though there are some stats behind it. First one is Void buff. Now Void buff is the new buff on the map and was kinda put there to take away the attack speed buff or take away the bores that came after and replace it with something else and not leave this niche empty. What Void buff offers is 10 protection reduction for gods only. Now first the plus side here. You get some early protection reduction, which is always nice for higher early base damage, but you also get the effect for your whole team, so enemies are affected by it and everyone attacking them gets this bonus damage. On the downside, that's about it. There is no protection reduction or extra damage or any sort against minions, nothing against the mitigations, so it doesn't do anything for your lane pressure in that regard, only for the boxing part of it. And it's also not that strong because it doesn't scale all too well into late game, it's simply just protection reduction. So if I had to pick a worse buff, for me personally, that would be Void buff. Then we have Blue buff. Blue buff gives you 25 MP5 and 10% cooldown reduction. The interesting part here is that one of these stats is much more for early game, and that's the 25 MP5, whereas the 10% CDR kinda maintain their value throughout the game, unless you get to the point where you have maxed out CDR. Then again, 10% cooldown reduction is nice, but it's not the best stat out there for late game, and the MP5 really won't give you all that much. You will rarely see somebody going out of the way in late game to pick up a blue buff. In the early game, however, blue buff allows solo in its current form to actually exist in the game. If it didn't exist, it would slow down the clear for pretty much any solo laner, simply because they wouldn't be able to use as many abilities to clear. It would probably slow down the fighting, it would minimize the kill potential as there would be less boxing going on, less trading, because losing more mana would mean harder punishment for you. And also, it would favor AA guards, basic attack guards, heavily in lane. Everyone who can make use of Death Toll better would benefit a lot more, because they're not as dependent on abilities. Guards like Osiris would just skyrocket in the meta, simply due to being based on basic attacks. I don't think a meta shift here would be inherently bad, but I could imagine better things. So I would say that it's a valuable buff as such, but I don't think it can compete with the other two that we have coming up still. Now, on paper, speed buff doesn't sound too crazy. 20% movement speed and that's it. But still, you will see junglers sacrificing their lives just to secure their speed buffs. The stat here is 20% movement speed. That is 2% more movement speed than boots, or often as much as 2 other movement speed items. A lot of items provide you with 10% movement speed. So as such, this has decent value just looking at this particular stat. But what is behind the stat and why is it so useful? A, it allows for chase potential. chase potential that many melee assassins especially otherwise don't have too much of. You kinda depend on that speed buff a little bit, because outside of your abilities, the means of sticking to the enemy may not be as good, especially in the current meta or in the current developments of most guards having a decent amount of mobility. It is very beneficial for them to get some movement speed to counter that. Additionally, you also get higher rotational speed, and that is extremely crucial for a jungler. If you're able to rotate across the map faster, then you will have more pressure, you will have more map control, and you can basically control the pace of the game for your team. And that in itself is so powerful that this 20% movement speed can really push you. Even though you will be okay without it, you will always have the upper hand as long as you have it. In late game, a lot of the potential still exists, especially the fact that you can still juke better through the speed buff and have the option to catch up to someone even after a longer fight, especially in late game where you have those team fights and pick someone off, is very beneficial. The benefit is not quite as high as in early game, but even being able to make it an objective in the last second can be useful sometimes. I do think that speed buff is extremely strong, but there's another competitor, and that is red buff. Red buff gives you plus 20% damage and plus 10 magical power or plus 5 physical power. Now, how beneficial this will be exactly depends a lot more on the character you're playing than the buff itself. 10 magical power in early game is alright, 5 physical power is okay too. The big benefit here is that it gives you a little bit of lane pressure over your opponent in the right matchup, and that can be beneficial for some characters. That's why we sometimes see this going to the hunters, and in other times we see it going to mid laners, really more depending on where the pressure is being built and who needs it more in that situation. The more important part here is the percentage part. The percentage part is something that will not only help you in early game, where you still get some extra damage on everything, but especially in late game, this is so valuable, and I feel like many people are actually undervaluing this. This damage percentage scales with most, if not all, damage amplifiers, so it will add a lot extra damage to the damage that you're already doing by pushing these numbers even further. And to put this in perspective, against the right target, this can actually do 200 extra damage on a hunter if that hunter has built some power and some crit. So a crit can deal an extra 200 damage if you have items like Deathbringer included in your build. 200 damage per basic attack is nothing that should be undervalued under any circumstances, so really this can have a massive impact. And that's why I choose two winners here. I think it's really hard to decide between the speed buff and the red buff. The speed buff gives you a massive amount of control across the map and massive amount of early pressure, where the red buff can give you a decent amount of early pressure and a massive amount of late game damage if used properly. The one you'll see picked up more often is probably the speed buff, but that's mostly down to the fact that in late game the fire giant side is just more interesting, and that's where the speed buff is, whereas on the gold fury side you don't have much going on and you have to go a bit more out of your way to pick up that red buff. I don't believe that any of the buffs are actually broken to the point where they need nerfing though. I believe that there's a good reason for the strength that certain buffs have over others. Feel free to leave your opinion in the comments down below if you feel that this was a justified evaluation of the buffs, or if you think that one of the buffs is drastically stronger or weaker than I thought. With that, thank you guys for watching. If you're not subscribed yet, feel free to click the sub button, maybe the bell, it really helps me out. Also, another benefit of the bell is that I will now often put a code either in the description or the comments, so if you're quick you can pick that up, and if you're notified first then you're obviously a bit quicker. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.